Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you how I feed my starter dough and some tips and tricks when doing your starter dough. To start off, I leave my sourdough in the fridge, so you're going to want to remove it from the fridge and let it sit on the counter for about 2 hours or until it becomes to room temperature. Once it's become to room temperature, then you're going to discard about half of what is in your jar. You'll get a hang of how much you need to discard in order for it to rise properly. So I normally like to have the jar about a third full when I'm done. This is the part that's a little bit controversial. I do not measure out how much starter is actually in my starter when I'm feeding it. I kind of eyeball it, so it's not technically a full 1-to-1 ratio. So you'll see that I discard also on a plate, and that is because sourdough is very bad for your drains. So I'll normally put it on a plate, and that way I can just throw it away and I don't have to worry about it clogging up my drains. I get asked often why I put my sourdough into the fridge, and it's mainly because I don't have to feed it every day. When it's in the fridge, you usually just have to feed it once a week is typically what I do. Again, there's so many rules and stipulations to sourdough that I try not to let it get in my head, and I try to just keep it as simple as possible. I'm a mom, I also run a business, so the easier the better for me. So once you have about a third of it left in your jar, then you're going to add in your warm water. And typically why I like to add in the warm water at this step is because you can mix it into the starter easier, and it allows for the flour to incorporate easier and throughout your starter. I've done it both ways, and I always notice that flour is harder to mix into this if the water is added after the flour is added. So the key tip that I found when doing this is to add warm water, and it'll help get your starter to a peak faster. And I like to get it to a peak faster because that way once it's at its peak, you put it back into the fridge. So with my starter, I like to do a 1-to-1 ratio with my water and flour that I'm adding in. So you'll see here I just added 103 milliliters of warm water, and then I'm going to add 103 milliliters of flour as well. But you want to make sure that you have the water very well stirred in, and this is also the time to start cleaning out the edges if possible. The most tedious part of this is all of the stirring that you'll have to do. It feels like you're stirring nonstop for pretty much 10 minutes, just making sure everything is well incorporated. Once you've stirred the water into the starter and you think that it's thoroughly mixed, then you're going to go ahead and add your flour. And again, we're going to basically just match the amount of water we put in with the amount of flour we're going to put in. I use unbleached flour, but you are more than welcome to use whatever type of flour you would like. I know many people use rye flour or they use wheat flour. It's really just a preference. So whatever your preference is, I just use unbleached flour to keep it simple. But I'll go ahead and add the unbleached flour, and then you will see I am not clean with this. There's always going to be a mess with flour in my kitchen. When I'm feeding my sourdough or making any type of bread, I just can't help it, and I just always make a mess. I have done it before where it's not exactly the same amount of numbers, and I don't notice a huge difference. It's just my personal preference that I try to get them the same exact numbers. It is a little bit OCD that it's 103, not 100, and that's typically, I normally like to add 100 grams of water to my 100 grams of flour. Once you have the same amount of flour as you added water into your starter mix, then you're going to stir. And this is going to be probably the longest amount of stirring you're going to have to do. You are going to want to make sure that all the flour clumps on the sides, at the bottom, that they're all well incorporated. You don't want any lumps of flour or clumps of flour into your starter mix. And basically what it'll do is create like this weird layer, and I've had it happen in my starter before. So if you make sure everything's well incorporated and well stirred, you do not have those issues. Now I'll get into some of the common questions I receive when doing sourdough. I offer sourdough at my farm stand, and so I've had many questions over the last year, kind of what I do when I'm feeding my sourdough or just how to maintain your sourdough. So I'll get into those now. And I think the number one thing is how to store it in the fridge. I like to have the lid on, but not completely tight. And basically that allows the air to flow out, but it doesn't allow as many bacteria and things from your fridge to get into it. The reason I keep mine in the fridge is so that way it's less maintenance. As I said before, I'm usually pretty busy. I normally only have time to feed my sourdough once a week, if that. I've heard that people can go a couple weeks without feeding their sourdough starter when it's in the fridge. I personally only like to stretch it out a week, and sometimes I'll do it more often within that week time span. It's really just depending on how busy my life is at the moment that I have to feed it. Now, if I want to make bread, what I do is I take the sourdough starter out and I leave it on the counter for however long it'll take for it to start rising and peaking again. And then once I use the active starter, I will then go ahead and feed it again and put it back in the fridge. So even if I fed it 2 days ago and put it in the fridge, when I take it out to use the bread, anytime I take out any of the starter, I always go ahead and feed it at that time too. Another common question is going to be about the hooch that your sourdough starter will create in your fridge, and it'll actually create it on the counter as well. But it's basically going to be almost like an oily, sometimes gray looking water on top of your sourdough starter. This is completely normal. It's just the gases and everything separating. What you will want to do is when you take it out of the fridge, if it doesn't start rising automatically and automatically mix in, you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that you stir it in very thoroughly before you discard and before you feed your starter. Other than that, there's really no extra steps when you put it in the fridge other than to take it out and put it in at the peak times. And that's pretty simple. It doesn't need to be any exact number. It's just eyeball, and you'll get a feel for your starter as it ages and you have experience with it, and you'll kind of know when it's ready to go back in and when it's ready, when you take it out, when you can start using it again. Something you'll be seeing me do here is I like to clean the jar as much as possible. I'll get sourdough that kind of cakes on to the top of the rim, and I like to try to clean that off, and I clean the lid as well before I put it back on. But I try to clean off that part and clean off the sides as much as possible. Your sourdough cups or whatever you have them in are going to get messy. I have 2 or 3 and I rotate between them. Once one gets very messy and just seems like it's a pain to keep clean, I'll go ahead and transfer it into the new jar that I have for it. And that way it just keeps the jar cleaner and it makes it look nicer, but it also, your hands don't get as messy when you're mixing it, and it looks better. My Pampered Chef scrapers are perfect for scraping off those stubborn pieces that are caked onto the side. This is another reason, as you can see, why I don't like to put sourdough down the drain if at all possible, because it will cake like this and get very hard in your drains. And I've heard of people having to have plumbers come out when they've had too much sourdough down their drain, so I just try to avoid it when at all possible. Once I have the jar clean to my liking, I go ahead and wash the lid and then set it on lightly so that way it still allows airflow, so that way your starter can peak. I leave the starter in my windowsill, and that way it kind of reaches a peak faster. And then once I set it up in the windowsill, that's my time to clean up all the flour and the mess that I made while feeding the sourdough. You will know your sourdough has peaked once it has at least doubled in size. If it triples in size, that means your sourdough is very active. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or concerns, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. And I hope you enjoy your sourdough starter.